HOA rules, she screamed, bringing the sledgehammer down on my wheelchair again and again. I lay helpless on the sidewalk, staring in horror as she destroyed my only means of mobility. The look of rage on her face as she raised the hammer for another blow is something I'll never forget. But when the officer arrived and said, "Ma'am, do you know who this is?" That's federal judge Caldwell, who wrote our nation's disability housing laws. Her face turned ghostly white. How did an HOA president's hatred of neighborhood eyesores lead her to commit a federal hate crime against the worst possible victim? For 15 years, I served as Judge Robert Caldwell on the Federal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, having received an unusually early appointment thanks to my specialized work in disability law. My landmark rulings on housing discrimination and disability rights established legal precedents that protect millions of Americans today. At 48, with multiple sclerosis gradually limiting my mobility, I never imagined I'd personally become a victim of the very discrimination I spent my career fighting against. After Martha, my wife of 20 years, passed away unexpectedly from a stroke last year, our sprawling family home where we'd raised 3 children and hosted 17 Thanksgiving dinners felt unbearably empty. Combined with my progressing MS, I was diagnosed 3 years ago when I started experiencing difficulty navigating courthouse steps. I made the practical decision to downsize. Suncrest Estates, an upscale, gated community outside Phoenix, marketed itself specifically to retired professionals seeking elegant, maintenance-free living. The community seemed perfect, single-level homes with wider doorways, gentle sloping entryways instead of steps, and just 15 minutes for my neurologist and physical therapy appointments. My custom-built titanium wheelchair, specially designed for my average frame and deteriorating muscle condition, cost over $30,000 but gave me the independence to continue living with dignity. The specialized ergonomic design prevented the pressure sores that could be life-threatening for someone with limited mobility, while the advanced control system compensated for my decreasing hand strength. Before purchasing my $685,000 Spanish-style villa in Suncrest, I meticulously reviewed the HOA covenant. Drawing on decades of judicial experience with property disputes, I confirmed that federal housing law would protect my reasonable accommodations. My realtor, Diane Halsey, even arranged a meeting with an HOA representative who assured me that minor modifications for medical needs were routinely approved. What I didn't realize was that Valerie Harmon, the HOA president, considered any visible sign of disability to be incompatible with her vision of the perfect neighborhood, and she was willing to go to extraordinary, eventually criminal, lengths to maintain that vision. The first warning sign appeared before the moving company had even finished unloading my belongings. A crisp white envelope bearing the Suncrest Estates logo was taped to my front door. Violation notice, unauthorized exterior modification, citing the professional-grade accessibility ramp I'd had installed at my front entrance. The next morning brought a personal visit from Valerie Harmon herself, a meticulously groomed woman in her mid-30s with sleek, styled dark hair, a tailored navy blue business suit that seemed to be her professional uniform, immaculate manicure, and a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Judge Caldwell," she said with synthetic warmth, clipboard clutched her chest like armor. "Welcome to Suncrest. I wanted to personally address this situation with your entryway. At Suncrest, we maintain our property values through aesthetic consistency. Your apparatus unfortunately disrupts our community standards." When I explained that the Americans with Disabilities Act and Fair Housing Act protected reasonable accommodations for medical necessities, her expression hardened noticeably. "With all due respect to your former position," she said, emphasizing former with unmistakable dismissiveness, "the AD doesn't supersede our covenants that you signed. Our residents choose Suncrest precisely because we don't look like a medical facility." That statement, equating accessibility with institutional aesthetics, revealed her perspective on disabled residents. Rather than engaging in a legal debate, I requested a formal accommodation hearing as outlined in Section 8.3 of their own bylaws. "Of course," she replied with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "Though I should warn you, The board rarely grants exceptions. Precedents are dangerous things, as I'm sure you understand from your former career. As she walked away, I noticed her taking photos of my specialized van with its wheelchair lift. By that afternoon, a second violation notice appeared. Commercial vehicles prohibited in driveways. The requested accommodation hearing was postponed 3 times over 8 weeks. Meanwhile, the violations multiplied with suspicious precision. My raised garden beds, unapproved landscaping modifications, $75 daily fine the bird feeder that provided simple joy during morning coffee, wildlife attraction nuisance, $50 daily fine the subtle blue trim on my house, unapproved color scheme, $100 daily fine the discrete solar path lights along my sidewalk for safety, non-standard exterior lighting, $50 daily fine when I installed automated blinds, a necessity given my limited arm mobility. A violation notice appeared within 3 hours, suggesting my home was under specific surveillance. These violations now totaled over $6,400 in fines, with threatening letters about property liens if they remained unpaid. Each appeal was systematically denied with identical form letters signed by Valerie herself. As I collected my mail one afternoon, my neighbor Claire Wilson, an 82-year-old widow with severe arthritis, invited me in for coffee. Her hands trembled noticeably as she poured, the result of both age and anxiety. "I see you've been getting Valerie's special welcome," she said, nodding toward the violation notice I'd tucked into my pocket. "She's been after me for 2 years about my mailbox bench." She explained she'd installed a small wooden bench beside her mailbox, a necessity for resting during her daily walk. Despite doctors' documentation of her arthritis, she'd accumulated over $3,800 in fines. "But that's nothing compared to what happened to the Thompsons," Claire continued, lowering her voice though we were alone. "Lovely family with a 19-year-old son with cerebral palsy. When they installed a pool lift for his physical therapy, Valerie went ballistic. Suddenly, every prospective buyer for their home mysteriously backed out at the last minute. They eventually sold for $85,000 below market value, to Valerie's sister-in-law, no less. My judicial training had taught me to look for patterns, and one was emerging clearly. I spent the next week discreetly speaking with other residents with visible disabilities or medical equipment. Michael Santos, a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran with PTSD and hearing loss, faced continuous harassment over his service dog. The Abramovitz family, whose 22-year-old daughter visited on weekends in her wheelchair, had been cited for a temporary ramp they used only during her visits. She told me to my face that emotional problems weren't real disabilities, Michael said bitterly. Said my service dog was just a pet with fancy paperwork. A disturbing truth was becoming evident. Suncrest Estates, beneath its manicured lawns and luxury facades, was systematically driving out anyone whose physical needs required visible accommodations. Rather than immediately escalating to federal action, I attempted resolution through professional mediation. I contacted my former law clerk Sandra Chun, now a prominent civil rights attorney, who arranged a formal meeting with the HOA board and their legal counsel. The meeting was scheduled at the community center, tellingly, in a second-floor room, despite the building having a perfectly functional elevator that was suddenly temporarily out of order on the day of our meeting. 2 kind neighbors helped carry me up the stairs, an intentional humiliation tactic that became evident when I saw the barely concealed satisfaction on Valerie's face as I was placed in a standard chair, my wheelchair left downstairs. "We appreciate you coming to us with your concerns." Before taking more adversarial measures, Valerie began, seated at the head of the conference table, surrounded by 4 other board members who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. Sandra presented a comprehensive legal brief outlining the specific Fair Housing Act violations and reasonable accommodation requirements. We offered a collaborative approach to update their policies rather than pursuing immediate legal action. "These minor modifications don't impact property values," I explained calmly. "In fact, communities with universal design principles often see increased valuations as they appeal to the growing senior market looking to age in place." The HOA's attorney, A young man named Preston, who kept glancing nervously at Valerie, began suggesting compromise solutions. Perhaps if the ramp were painted to match the house exterior and the garden beds were reduced in height by 6 inches. Valerie cut him off abruptly. "We have senior legal counsel on retainer who disagrees entirely with your interpretation," she declared, though no such expert was present. Suncrest has successfully defended its standards for 15 years. When Sandra mentioned my judicial background in disability law as relevant expertise, Valerie's response was chilling. "Former occupations are irrelevant here, Mr. Caldwell. Everyone follows the same rules, or they should find more accommodating communities." Her deliberate use of Mr. rather than Judge and the emphasis on accommodating made her discriminatory intent unmistakable. As we left, I heard her mutter to another board member, "If we make one exception, before you know it, we'll look like a nursing home." This wasn't about property values or aesthetics. It was about creating a community where disabilities remained invisible, where the realities of aging were carefully concealed behind a facade of perpetual vitality. Recognizing we were dealing with systemic discrimination requiring substantial evidence, I began methodically building a case. I installed legal security cameras around my property. I recorded all interactions, kept detailed records of every notice, and documented the selective enforcement of rules. Working quietly with Sandra, I connected with other affected residents. We documented 23 cases where residents with visible disabilities faced stricter enforcement than their non-disabled neighbors with identical issues. Property records revealed a troubling trend. Over the past 5 years, 14 residents with disabilities had sold their homes at below-market prices after facing repeated HOA violations. Through public records requests and contacts from my judicial career, we discovered something even more disturbing. At a real estate investment conference 3 years earlier, Valerie had been a featured speaker on maintaining neighborhood value through strategic covenant enforcement. Her presentation slides, which we obtained, included phrases like discouraging undesirable demographic shifts and using technical violations to protect community investment. Most damning was an email to board members from Valerie stating, "The Davidsons' request for a wheelchair ramp must be denied. Once we allow one visible accommodation, we'll be overrun with medical equipment that depresses property values. Better one family moves than all our investments suffer." I filed formal complaints with the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Arizona Attorney General's Civil Rights Division, attaching our substantial evidence. Both opened investigations, but warned the process could take 6 to 9 months. The retaliation was swift and calculated. My water pressure mysteriously dropped to a trickle. Maintenance requests went unanswered. Landscape crews accidentally damaged my accessible garden beds. Community security performed wellness checks at 11 p.m., claiming concerned neighbor reports about unusual noises. Anonymous notes appeared in my mailbox. "If you can't maintain normal property standards, perhaps assisted living would be more appropriate." Despite this escalating harassment, I remained resolute. I'd spent my career ensuring the law protected vulnerable citizens. I wouldn't abandon that principle now that I was among them. After 7 months of this psychological warfare, my neurologist prescribed hydrotherapy for my increasingly painful muscle spasms, a common MS complication exacerbated by stress. I installed a portable therapeutic whirlpool on my private enclosed patio, completely invisible from the street or neighboring properties. 3 days later, while soaking in the therapeutic waters as prescribed, my security system alerted me to multiple people entering my backyard. Through the glass doors, I saw Valerie leading 2 uniformed maintenance workers toward my patio, one carrying tools and the other looking distinctly uncomfortable. I quickly transferred to my wheelchair, a difficult process that took nearly 2 minutes, and rolled outside. "You're trespassing on private property," I stated firmly, positioning myself between them and the therapeutic unit. "Please leave immediately." Valerie thrust a paper toward me. "Emergency abatement notice. Your unauthorized hot tub violates 3 separate covenants and poses a health hazard. We're removing it now." This is a prescribed medical device, I explained, holding up my doctor's documentation in a waterproof folder I fortunately had nearby. And regardless, you have no legal right to enter my property without court authorization. She snatched the medical documentation, tore it in half without even glancing at it, and nodded to the workers. Remove it immediately. The men hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Ms. Harmon, this doesn't seem right, the older of the two said. Shouldn't we get proper authorization first? This looks like medical equipment. I am the authorization, she shouted, her composed facade cracking completely. Do your jobs, or find new ones. This neighborhood is not going to look like a hospital on my watch. When they still hesitated, she stormed to their truck, returning moments later with a heavy sledgehammer. Fine, I'll do it myself. I've handled problems like this before. I positioned my wheelchair directly between her and the therapeutic unit. Valerie, stop. This is breaking multiple laws. Think about what you're doing. This is criminal trespassing and destruction of medical equipment. That morning, I had dressed in my favorite light gray suit, a habit from my years on the bench that I maintained during important meetings, hoping that a professional appearance might help Valerie take my concerns more seriously. Rather than confronting her at my home, I decided to address the issue during my daily wheel around the neighborhood. I approached Valerie as she was inspecting another resident's lawn. Ms. Harmon, we need to discuss these unreasonable violations, I began calmly. She turned, her face instantly hardening when she saw me. Judge Caldwell, out in your eyesore again, I see. This eyesore is medically necessary equipment protected by federal law, I replied. Your federal laws don't override MY community standards, she suddenly shouted, her composure completely dissolving. Before I could respond, she spotted a landscaper's sledgehammer leaning against a nearby tree. What happened next was so shocking that even now it seems surreal. She lunged for the hammer, grabbed it with both hands, and advanced toward me on the sidewalk. I've had enough of your special accommodations and legal threats. Valerie stood there in her impeccable navy business suit, her professional appearance a stark contrast to the unhinged fury in her eyes as she raised the sledgehammer above her head. Valerie, put that down immediately, I warned, attempting to back my wheelchair away. This is what I think of your special equipment, she screamed, bringing the hammer down on my wheelchair with stunning force. The impact caught the right wheel, instantly buckling it. I tried to maneuver away, but the damage will cause my chair to tip. I fell sideways onto the concrete sidewalk, landing hard on my hip with a sickening crack. The pain was immediate and blinding. But Valerie wasn't finished. With my wheelchair, now half collapsed, and me sprawled helplessly on the ground, she raised the sledgehammer again, her buttocks lifted high with the effort, face contorted with rage. HOA rules, she screamed, bringing the hammer down on the control panel, shattering it completely. Sparks flew as the electronics that gave me independence were destroyed. Please stop, I gasped, truly terrified as I looked up at her from the ground. It's custom medical equipment worth over $30,000. My plea only seemed to fuel her frenzy. She struck again and again, methodically destroying each component, the frame, the specialized cushions, the remaining wheel. With each blow, she screamed phrases that would later become damning evidence. No eyesores in MY neighborhood. These people and their special equipment. This is what happens when you challenge the HOA. Several neighbors had gathered, watching in horror. One was recording the incident on his phone, capturing Valerie's unhinged destruction and my terrified expression as I lay helpless, watching my only means of mobility being demolished before my eyes. Throughout this destruction, my phone, which had fallen from my pocket during the fall, was recording everything from its position on the sidewalk. This unplanned evidence captured not just the physical destruction, but Valerie's stream of discriminatory comments. This is what happens when we let these people in, and disabilities belong in nursing homes, not in Suncrest. The maintenance workers stood frozen in horror, the older one still on the phone with emergency services, describing the scene in disbelieving tones while his younger colleague recorded video on his own phone, an act of moral courage that would cost him his job, but provide crucial corroborating evidence. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes, responding to multiple 911 calls from horrified onlookers. As the EMTs stabilized my hip and prepared me for transport, Officer Rivera took my statement while his partner separated Valerie from what remained of my wheelchair. She just kept swinging that sledgehammer, one neighbor told the officers, showing them the video they'd recorded. Even after he fell, she seemed almost happy about it. Officer Rivera, reviewing my identification, suddenly looked up with widened eyes. "Wait, are you Judge Robert Caldwell? From a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals?" When I confirmed my identity through waves of pain, he immediately walked over to his partner, who was questioning Valerie. After a brief, whispered exchange, the other officer's expression changed dramatically. He immediately pulled out handcuffs and began reading Valerie her rights. "This is absurd," she protested, attempting to regain her composure. "I was enforcing legitimate community standards, as is my right as HOA president. Who exactly does he think he is to ignore our rules?" "That man," Officer Rivera stated loudly enough for everyone to hear, "is former federal Judge Robert Caldwell, who literally wrote the controlling legal precedent on housing discrimination against disabled Americans in Westbrook versus Fairfield communities. The case law he established is taught in every police academy in this state." Valerie's face drained of color as the implications hit her. "I had no idea." "So you're admitting you would have treated him differently if you'd known he was a federal judge?" the officer interrupted. "That just makes the discriminatory intent even clearer. This isn't about who he is, it's about what you did. And what you did appears to constitute a federal hate crime." As the maintenance workers provided their statements, they revealed this wasn't an isolated incident. They had been directed to remove accessibility modifications from multiple homes, but had never witnessed this level of direct violence. She told us last month that problem residents sometimes need to be encouraged to leave, the older worker admitted. "We didn't understand what she meant until today. As I was loaded into the ambulance, my last view before the doors closed was of Valerie being placed in the police cruiser, the realization of her actions finally registering on her face. She had targeted the wrong person, not because I deserved special treatment, but because I had the knowledge, resources, and determination to expose the systematic discrimination she had weaponized against vulnerable residents. From my hospital bed, while doctors prepare me for hip replacement surgery, I made 3 crucial calls. First, to Sandra Chun, who immediately filed for an emergency injunction against the HOA and began preparing multiple federal civil rights claims. Second, to James Martinez, U.S. Attorney for Arizona and my former law clerk from 1998, who personally initiated a federal hate crime investigation based on disability status, one of the first such cases involving housing discrimination. Third, to Elizabeth Warren, an investigative journalist who had covered several of my disability rights rulings. Within hours, the story was breaking across national news outlets. HOA president destroys federal judge's wheelchair in violent hate crime. The security footage and audio recording of the incident, showing Valerie's clear discriminatory statements while destroying medically necessary equipment, went viral overnight. The image of her standing over my destroyed wheelchair, sledgehammer raised triumphantly, became emblematic of HOA overreach nationwide. Senior living communities across America were suddenly examining their own accommodation policies. Disability rights organizations reported a 300% increase in housing discrimination complaints. The incident had struck a nerve with millions of Americans navigating the challenges of aging in their own homes while facing institutional barriers. As I recovered from surgery, my hospital room became an unexpected hub of activity. Flowers and cards arrived from former colleagues on the federal bench. Law professors cited the Caldwell incident in classes on fair housing law. Most touchingly, dozens of disabled Americans sent messages describing their own housing discrimination experiences, many thanking me for inadvertently bringing national attention to an issue that had been invisible for too long. My recovery was complicated by my MS, extending my hospital stay to 3 weeks. During this time, an unexpected parade of visitors revealed the far-reaching implications of Valerie's actions. Claire and Michael, my neighbors who had faced discrimination, brought a petition signed by 78 Suncrest residents condemning Valerie's actions and calling for her removal from a board. State Senator Eleanor Ramsey, herself a polio survivor, visited to discuss emergency legislation on HOA oversight. "What happened to you is happening to thousands of seniors across Arizona," she explained. "But without your profile, their stories go untold." Most surprisingly, Thomas Harrington, the 82-year-old developer who had originally built Suncrest Estates 15 years earlier, arrived visibly distressed. "My late wife used a wheelchair for 10 years before her passing," he revealed. "I built this community with extra-wide doorways and accessible features intentionally. What has become under this HOA is a betrayal of everything I intended." Harrington provided damning evidence. Original community plans highlighting accessibility features that have been systematically removed, and communications showing how Valerie had deliberately worked to make the community less accessible to maintain a certain community profile. As the court-appointed receiver began examining the HOA's financial records and enforcement patterns, they uncovered something even more sinister than discrimination. Valerie had been directing violation notices predominantly toward elderly and disabled residents, driving them out through harassment, then purchasing their devalued properties through a shell company called Pristine Neighborhood Investments. Once the undesirable modifications were removed, she would resell the properties at full market value, pocketing profits averaging $85,000 per home. Over 5 years, this scheme had generated nearly $2 million in fraudulent profits while systematically removing disabled residents from the community. Banking records revealed similar patterns in 2 other retirement communities where Valerie had previously served on HOA boards. What had begun as a disability discrimination case had uncovered elder financial abuse, real estate fraud, and civil racketeering violations. 4 months after the incident, still using a temporary wheelchair as I continued physical therapy for my healing hip, I attended a special community meeting at Suncrest Estates, held in the properly accessible community room with a functioning elevator. The interim HOA board, led by Michael Santos, began with a formal apology to all residents who had experienced discrimination, followed by the introduction of new community guidelines developed with input from disability rights organizations and elder advocacy groups. Thomas Harrington announced a $1.2 million community renovation project to restore and enhance the accessibility features of his original design, personally funding improvements that would make Suncrest a model of inclusive living for active seniors. "This community was designed for people to age in place with dignity," he explained to enthusiastic applause. "That vision got corrupted by greed and prejudice. Today, we reclaim it." Most importantly, residents who had been forced out by discriminatory practices were contacted and offered the opportunity to return with compensation for their losses. The Thompson family, whose son's cerebral palsy had made them targets of Valerie's campaign, were the first to return, receiving their home back at the price they had been forced to sell it for, plus damages. The Caldwell incident, as it became known in legal circles, sparked statewide change. Arizona passed the Housing Equality and Accessibility Rights Act, creating strict oversight of HOA practices and establishing the strongest protections for disabled homeowners in the nation. Similar legislation was introduced in 26 other states within a year. 14 months after that terrible day, I sat in a familiar setting, a federal courtroom, but in an unfamiliar role as the primary witness rather than the judge. My new custom wheelchair, with enhanced features for my progressing condition, positioned me directly across from Valerie Harmon, whose carefully maintained appearance had deteriorated after months in pretrial detention. The trial was comprehensive but efficient. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage, audio recordings, financial records, and testimony from dozens of victims created an airtight case that even the most expensive defense attorney couldn't overcome. When finally asked directly why she had targeted disabled residents, Valerie revealed the prejudice that had driven her actions. They lower property values just by being visible in the community. People don't want to see wheelchairs and ramps and medical equipment, when they're buying their dream home. I was protecting our investments. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, including federal hate crimes, wire fraud, and racketeering charges. The judge, ironically, a former clerk of mine from 20 years earlier, sentenced her to 9 years in federal prison, along with $4.2 million in restitution payments to the victims of her discrimination and fraud. The court ordered that after serving her sentence, Valerie would complete 2,000 hours of community service, specifically assisting at a rehabilitation center, helping newly disabled individuals adapt to wheelchair use and navigate housing accommodation requests. Today, 18 months after Valerie's sledgehammer destroyed my wheelchair on that suburban sidewalk, I've established the Caldwell Foundation for Housing Equity, using the substantial settlement from my civil case to provide legal assistance to disabled homeowners facing discrimination. We've already helped over 300 families nationwide stand up to housing discrimination and HOA overreach. Suncrest Estates has become a nationally recognized model community for accessible living, with prospective HOA board members required to complete disability awareness training before running for positions. Property values have increased by 12% since implementing universal design principles throughout the community, proving that accessibility and profitability can go hand in hand. The incident was captured in a viral photo showing Valerie with a hammer raised above my destroyed wheelchair as I lay terrified on the sidewalk. That image has become a powerful symbol in the fight against housing discrimination nationwide. My message to anyone facing housing discrimination is simple: document everything. Know your rights. And remember that sometimes the person they're trying to bully is exactly the wrong person to target. Someone with both the knowledge and determination to change not just their own situation, but the system itself.